All right, hello. My name is Cade McCall. I am a lecturer and assistant professor in the psychology department at the University of York. And today I'm going to be speaking with Jessica Nordell about her book, The End of Bias. So we'll begin in a moment, but before we begin, I have a few technical notes for you. If you are watching us live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. So you should see that on your screen. And this will be available throughout the event, so you can ask a question whenever it arises. So should you have any technical issues during the interview and you lose Wi-Fi, for example, you can rejoin the event by using the original link that you used. So please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it again if you want to. Subtitles are also available in this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get rolling. So Jessica Nordell is a journalist, award-winning radio producer, and writer who studied at Harvard University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she now lives in Minneapolis. As a young journalist, Jessica became fascinated with unconscious bias when she discovered that she had greater success at landing pitches when using her initials rather than her full name. Since then, her groundbreaking work has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Republic, and The New York Times, among other publications. The End of Bias is her first book, and I'm delighted to be chatting with Jessica about this tonight. During our conversation, we're going to talk about fascinating research into unconscious bias and what real-world steps we might be able to take to counteract that bias. We would like you, the audience, to take part in the discussion. So as I said before, to do so, add your questions using the Q&A button on your screen. And you can do that whenever you want, whenever the question comes up. And I will start this interview with a few of my own questions, but I'll keep my eye on the Q&A so we can get you all involved. Okay, so I just want to start things off first by welcoming Jessica. Hello.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with you today.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you. So I want to start things off by asking you sort of basic questions about your approach to writing this book. So although your book very clearly focuses on psychology research and cognitive science, you also include important insights from other disciplines, including ethics and law and history and political science. Can you talk a little bit about why you took that interdisciplinary approach, and if you think that sort of interdisciplinary approach is important to addressing unconscious bias just generally?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I definitely started this project in psychology, looking at cognitive psychology in particular, which is where we think of kind of implicit bias and unconscious bias research emerging from. But what I found really quickly was that I couldn't stay just in psychology. And I certainly couldn't just stay in cognitive psychology, because bias might emerge in the mind of the individual, but as soon as it's expressed, it affects a person. So this becomes a dynamic, interactive experience where if I'm acting in a biased way toward you, that is going to in turn affect how you act toward me and think about me and think about other people, which then in turn affects how I act toward you again. And so it becomes this much more complex process. So now I was into social psychology and getting even a little bit bigger, looking at how groups of people interacted. Then I was into organizational psychology and even sociology, looking at large groups. But I couldn't stop there, because I also wanted to understand where these ideas come from. So if we think about implicit bias or unconscious bias, or as I like to think of it, unexamined bias, these are inherited ideas that live in our memories that then become activated when we encounter a person and the ideas kind of come to the fore. So my question at some point in the project was, well, where did these ideas come from? So then now I'm adding in the dimension of time, going back in time. What's the origin of these ideas? How did they evolve over time so that we inherit them and learn them in the year 2022? So now I'm into history, and even deeper Egyptology and Assyriology, because I was really trying to figure out, okay, where did the idea of male superiority come from? Where did the idea of white superiority come from? It was an invention. It was a human invention. So then I wanted to watch how it emerged over time. So then I was into history. But then if you look at the other dimension of time and try to look at the future and the consequences of this behavior, then now you're into ethics and law and morality. And so I think it's an interesting question. And what I guess my answer is, I discovered that if I really wanted to look at this in a complex way that did justice to the way bias exists in the world and how it affects people in the world, I couldn't just stay in psychology because there were too many other competing, overlapping disciplines that could be brought to bear on this massive, complicated, and challenging problem of bias in the world.
Absolutely, that's fascinating. So, I mean, it sounds like ultimately it becomes a matter of almost constraining yourself, given all the different directions one can go with the research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, interestingly, like, you know, as a sort of an aha moment in the process, I was looking at other people who had thought about this problem before it was really emerging in psychology in the 1980s. And what I found was that the very best definition of unconscious bias that I ever read came from a lawyer in 1928. And I'll read to you what she said. This was Alina Olive Smith, who was the first Black woman to become a lawyer in the state of Minnesota. This was in 1928. The psychology field was not thinking about unconscious bias at all. This is what she wrote. It is common knowledge a feeling can be so dormant and subjected to one's subconsciousness that one is wholly ignorant of its existence. But if the proper stimulus is applied, it comes to the front, and more often than not, one is deceived into believing it is justice speaking to him, when in fact it is prejudice, blinding him to all justice and fairness.
Wow.
I mean, is that a perfect definition of unconscious bias? And she understood it in the context of the law. So I think that just kind of points to what we're talking about, which is that this is a multidisciplinary kind of problem and requires multidisciplinary responses too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Was she heard at the time? Do you think that was she read? I guess I should say.
That's a good question. That particular quote I found in a legal opinion that she wrote in the 1920s. And Fantastic. I don't know, she isn't very well known. So I don't know much about what happened as a consequence of that. Yeah. But I would like to look into it and find out what the response was to that.
Yeah. Fascinating. So I guess my next question is sort of going in the opposite direction. I'm going to ask you to think a little narrowly. So when I was thinking of questions I wanted to ask you, I imagine, one of the first questions that came to my mind, and one of the questions that I suspect you hear a lot is, so based on the evidence that you've read, what's the best intervention to reduce prejudice? Now, I know that question doesn't do justice to the complexity of the topic or the complexity of your book, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So based on the evidence, what's the best intervention to reduce prejudice or to reduce bias?
I do get that question a lot. People will say, okay, just tell me the answer, and you're right. There isn't a single solution or silver bullet. It depends on so many things: context, resources, who we're talking about, what the kind of prejudice is that we're trying to reduce. I would say the very best kind of intervention is one that is impossible in physical reality, which would be for us all to be able to be transported into the body of a person of a different identity and live in that spirit and body and physical reality. One of the reason that I started the book with the story of a transgender neurobiologist named Ben Barris is that his experience was that he lived the first part of his life presenting to the world as a woman and then underwent a gender transition and began presenting to the world as a man. And he was a scientist throughout this entire time. And his revelation about how he was treated differently once he presented to the world as a man like transformed his life, his perception, his trajectory. It was transformative. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would have all of us live as another human being. But since that's not possible, in the book, I go, this was my question, like, what's the best one? And so I look at a variety of different interventions that have different kinds of positive consequences, from individual interventions like developing more personal awareness and skills, habits of mind that allow one to become aware of one's behavior, and that can be very powerful. Some of the most powerful interventions in my mind are actually interventions that increase the complexity with which we see another group. So, and these can take lots of different forms, but like for one example, there was a group of people in France, some researchers in France working on anti-Arab prejudice in France. And the intervention that they did was a media intervention. So they created these posters that they plastered in different places like doctors' offices, physical therapy offices, and universities and high schools. And some of the posters showed a group of people of Arab origin being described in kind of similar terms. And in the other, there was a poster of a group of people of Arab origin being described as very different from one another. So a person's picture and name, and then a description like stingy or generous or friendly or arrogant or unpleasant or happy, sort of like all of these different personality characteristics. And what they found was that for people who had been exposed to that presentation, that here are all of these people of Arab origin that share this identity, and they're all really different from each other. Mm-hmm. Those French people who had seen that behaved differently toward people of Arab origin in the real world afterwards. And that was one intervention that kind of is part of a school of thought, which is that if we can increase the diversity with which we see a group as having, that starts to really break down bias, because it's very hard to stereotype a group if you understand that, and and especially from personal experience, that group is actually very diverse. From the people in that group are very different from one another. So that is one kind of school of interventions that I'm pretty bullish on at this point. Mm-hmm.
So is it fair to say then it's sort of an intervention that plays with the structure that you have in your mind, not just the content of it? So you're not saying everyone's good. It's playing with the structure of your representation of the individuals within the group.
Yes, because we have this tendency toward out-group homogeneity. We think our own group is really diverse and really complex, but the group that we don't belong to, in this case, for the non-Arab French people, Arab French people, the group that they didn't belong to is kind of similar to one another. They have a lot in common. And so when you start to break apart that out-group homogeneity, absolutely. The sort of the way that we approach that group then becomes hopefully, more similar to the way we approach our own group, which is like, oh, people are really different from each other. Like I can't necessarily stereotype the people in my own group as easily as I stereotype others.
Right. Fantastic. Interesting. So that leads to my next question, which is about sort of the risk-taking and the sort of emotional consequences of these kinds of interventions. So in the book, you talk about an intervention done at the University of Wisconsin-Madison with Trish Devine and Will Cox, who are psychology, or they're both faculty at the University of Wisconsin. And you tell a story about an intervention that they were leading. And so in the story, it struck me that it was the intervention itself. It was a sort of a workshop. It's kind of an emotional, risk-taking event in that, it's sort of risk-taking for the faculty members themselves to speak openly and honestly about race. I think they were focusing on race in the story. It's risky for Black students. There's a Black student in the story. It's risky for that person to come in the room and know that they're going to be the center of attention at different moments, and they're going to perhaps be framed as an exemplar at different moments. And it's also risky for the non-Black people in the audience who are maybe might be worried about being singled out, or they might blurt out something that reveals their unconscious bias. So I think for all parties involved, there's some kind of emotion, there's some kind of risk taking. And I wonder if that's common across the interventions you looked at, and if you think that's an important issue.
Interesting. Yes. I think there are a lot of different kinds of risk that this work entails. You know, when you mention risk, the first thing that comes to mind is the risk that an intervention could make things worse, which happens sometimes. One of the stories I tell in the book is of Rebecca Bigler, who's a developmental psychologist. And she was doing, she was trying to understand how prejudice develops in children. And in order to do this, she set up a lot of different experiments to kind of manipulate the kind of environment that children were experiencing. And in one of them, she was working with a school and with very young children, like 3 and 4 years old. And she was looking at sexism, how sexism emerges in children. And her hypothesis, which has been proven by a lot of her research, is that the more we label children and the more we separate and segregate on the basis of gender or any identity, the more stereotyping happens among children. So she was doing this with really young children. She had teachers label the children and constantly say, hello boys, hello girls, separate the children by gender in the classroom, organize the children by gender. And it went really badly. It went so badly that they had to cancel the experiment because the children had started to behave in hostile ways toward each other. And so she canceled the experiment and had to kind of do an intervention to kind of undo the consequences of this experiment. And so there is risk in this work, absolutely. Like things could become worse. I think that the hope is that in undertaking that kind of risk in the context of the experiment or the intervention, we're learning something really important that allows us to decrease the larger risk that we have in society that comes from not addressing these things at all, or not understanding them, or not intervening in them at all. Because these small situations are microcosms of larger social realities that we're trying to understand. So I think, assuming a risk is kind of perhaps a necessary evil. I don't know if it's necessarily evil, but a necessary part of doing this work. But yeah, I mean, the point that you're making about emotional risk is very real. I think that anytime we open ourselves to change or open ourselves to something different than the status quo, that's emotionally risky. It's like stepping into the unknown, giving up the devil we know for the maybe devil we don't know, or angel we don't, something that we don't know. And so that's emotionally risky. I think adding onto just any kind of change or leaving the status quo, when we're stepping into a context of diversity, people who are different from us, different from one another, there's an additional emotional risk because the stakes are high. It can be easy to accidentally say the wrong thing, to not know what's happening. There's so much unknown when we are interacting with people from different backgrounds and different experiences. So yeah, I mean, I think that this work is like full of risk, lots of different kinds of risk. The larger risk, I think, is that we continue to perpetuate bias and discrimination and prejudice in ways that harm careers, livelihoods, health, even life itself, create risk to life itself. And so, yeah, in a sense, it seems like we undertake this, necessary maybe controlled risk in a
Mhm.
sort of a specific context in order to try to find ways to address the larger, really, really consequential risk in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, one of the things you said in there makes me think about sort of knowingness in general. So I think in my own life, in experiencing bias and finding discovering biases in myself, it's sort of like I found myself in a trap of knowingness where I think I thought I knew something, and
Yes.
then it gets thrown in my face that I really didn't. And I think that can be a painful and humiliating moment, but I mean, so ideally I should embrace that moment and evolve with it, but but I could, in a vulnerable moment, you can see going the opposite direction and building up the wall.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's see. So I had another question that was related to that. So okay, so yeah, throughout the book, you talk about your own experiences with bias, both in terms of being the target of bias and also in terms of addressing your own biases and the process that we were just talking about, I think. And I want to first talk about the latter. So you write at one point, let me get the quote here. The most essential part of this journey was making and learning from mistakes. Once I set aside my attachment to notions of my rightness, I could take an honest inventory of the fears, errors, lack of skill, and biases that had led me to act in ways that harmed others. This happened again and again as I faced my mental conditioning regarding myriad social identities, including my own. So to me, that passage captures a recurring theme in the book that addressing bias requires not just individual interventions, but kind of like a work ethic. So I'm wondering if first of all, if you're willing to use the word work ethic or term work ethic, and if you could sort of describe that work ethic.
I really like that term. Yes. I think sometimes with this problem of bias and discrimination, people want a sort of a checklist or a thing that they can do and then not have it be a problem anymore. I think a better way of thinking about this is it's more like learning a language. So if you're trying to become fluent in a language, you know that this takes a long time, a lot of effort, making mistakes, trying things, getting better slowly, and you can't use a checklist approach. You can't do something once or twice. You have to really practice it over a long period of time. And maybe like learning a language, maybe it's a reasonable comparison, because like learning a language, you can't really achieve fluency just sitting in a room by yourself, reading books or listening to podcasts or, thinking or practicing in your own mind. You really have to be out in the world with people, in situations, in different contexts, kind of developing those muscles, developing those skills, and and making mistakes and learning from mistakes. And so there are many moments that I found when I was doing the research and talking to a lot of different people. There are many moments along this journey of unlearning our biases where there's a temptation to want to give up because it's hard and it can be emotionally very challenging. Like, as you described, when you see something in your own mind that you hadn't seen before, you can feel a sense of shame, embarrassment, especially if it happens in public. It can be very embarrassing, and there can be this sort of desire to just hide and completely disengage. And so I think where the work ethic comes in is in, first of all, being able to manage that emotional experience, which is hard. I do not want to underplay how hard that can be when one is stepping into a new context, trying out new skills, trying to relate to the world and other people in a different way, and then one screws up, that can be very emotionally challenging. And I've experienced it a lot, so I really know what that's like. I think where the work ethic comes in is in managing that feeling and then holding that discomfort against the larger values that one is trying to live into. Values like learning how to relate to others in a humane way, learning how to develop fluency with people of different identities so that you can build trustworthy relationships, trusting relationships, just wanting to be part of a better world, a more just world, a more fair world. So I think what helps me is when I'm in a moment of despair or emotional discomfort, reminding myself, okay, first of all, this is a process. This is like learning a language. I'm developing skills and fluency. And also, I'm motivated to keep doing it because of that larger value of humanity, really, connection and fairness and justice. And that, I think that helps kind of bolster the work ethic that you really rightly point out is essential.
The language, learning a language metaphor is really great because, like you say, you can't learn a language just from passively, really. Like you use the word immersion often with languages. You need to be immersed in it to become fluent, which makes me think of your point at the beginning of that your dream intervention is that people could be sort of immersed in another identity. And indeed, yeah, that makes good sense and and the temptation to pull yourself out of the immersion when something embarrassing happens takes you out of the learning process. So, yeah. Let's see, we have a question from the audience from Jude. So often the media, TV and film, in using actors with more diverse experience can contextualize them in situations that reinforce stereotypes. How can this be addressed? How can we watch these actors with non-biased eyes?
I think what's important here is knowing the patterns that are being reinforced. So I think ideally, my media intervention would be that people who are creating media would create media that shows a wide variety of people from all different identities. So we think of diversity in media as being like, we have a representative from this group, a representative from this group, a representative from this group, and now we have, some kind of idealized, diverse group. From a media creation perspective, I think what we should think about diversity differently. I think we should look at it as, for any given group, we need a diversity of people who are belonging to that group, whatever that identity is. And so that would be my answer to the sort of media creation part of it. As a viewer, though, you can't necessarily control, what media is created. So you could approach it in different ways. I mean, you could certainly choose if you see a film or a TV show that is just egregiously representing people in egregiously stereotyped ways, you can certainly opt to turn it off, not watch it. But if you want to watch it, I think it's important to keep those patterns in mind and be able to look at it with kind of a metacognitive lens. So you're watching it, but you're also thinking about what these stereotypes are and how they might be affecting you. I have a whole chapter in my book that kind of looks at how we develop these stereotypes and associations and how they're reinforced by media. And it's risky because it's very risky because there's some research that suggests that when the stereotypes we have are confirmed, this is a rewarding experience. This feels like we have a pattern matching experience and it feels almost neurally pleasurable. And so that's something else to keep in mind, when we're watching these media representations, like, wow, I'm watching a stereotype and it actually is kind of a satisfying experience. It can be neurally feel satisfying. Let me think about that. Like, what's going on in my mind? What's going on with these stereotypes? And let me think about this really critically, and hopefully seek out media that doesn't, create those problems in the future.
Yeah, that you raise a point again there about how important it is just heterogeneity of representations of a given group. So it's not just about putting positive figures from a given group on TV or in fiction. It's about providing that diversity. And it makes me think of my own growing up gay in the 70s and 80s. The representations of gay men in the media were not, they weren't pretty. But I remember even at the time, even when there were sort of different outrageous versions of being gay being portrayed, as long as there was sort of a selection, it was a relief to me somehow, as opposed to like this homogeneous, extremely negative representation. So this really rings true. What the point you're making about heterogeneity. Yeah. Jude followed up there with, I think you're really interesting, important for children to be given the tools for this self-reflection.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm thinking about maybe doing like a young reader's version of the book for that reason, so that the ideas and tools can be, like shared with young people as they are actually developing their mental architecture.
Yeah. And giving them the language, like you were saying earlier. Yeah. So there was a point, let's see. So earlier I brought up the point we were talking about confronting one's own biases, but I was wondering, going back to that idea of one's own experience, your own experience, how has working on this topic and working on this book, how has it changed the way in which you experience bias when you're the target of the bias, or when you witness someone else be the target of the bias?
It has definitely changed. It has definitely changed my reaction to being the target of bias. I would say that I have less of an anger response now than I did before, and just a generally less kind of emotionally reactive response, because I can understand, and I don't mean to necessarily excuse or like exonerate a person for bad behavior, but if someone is behaving in a way toward me that is like sexist, where I can tell that they're kind of condescending in a way that's very familiar to women, because we are condescended to frequently. When I experience that, I think instead of just being angry at that person, I see the social and cultural forces that have created that person's response toward me. And in some ways, I think, given the strength of our cultural conditioning, it is shocking when someone doesn't behave that way. It's such a joy to me when I interact with someone and I don't receive, that layer of condescension, gender bias, sort of doubt, questioning, like all of these sort of patterns that women experience. And so I think I've become less angry about it and more reflective. I had this really interesting conversation with, the psychologist Jim Sedanius, who developed social dominance theory, social dominance orientation, unfortunately passed away recently. But I spoke with him maybe about a year ago, and I asked him this question as well. So he was a very prominent African-American psychology professor. And he said he at that point said he had become less angry, and not in a way that made it okay for someone to behave in a racist or racially biased way toward him. But he said in the same way that he would treat a snake that bit him. It is the nature, he said, it is the nature of the snake to behave this way. I'm not going to get angry at the snake. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I would use the word nature. I would say maybe it's the nurture of the snake to behave this way. But I think I followed a similar trajectory as Dr. Sedanius in that way.
Mhm.
There's more compassion for people who behave badly toward me, for better or for worse.
Right.
I don't know. Do you feel like, I'm curious, can I ask you, like, have you had what has been your journey toward, in the same realm? How do you feel about people who react in biased ways toward you?
Somehow, I think one of the reasons, like when reading bias research and been doing a little bit of it, I've always been interested in the motivational side of it, because clearly there's a cognitive side about the motivational side. And I think that comes from my own personal experience, experiencing pretty clear homophobia from people who I liked and so I know, and I believe they're good people. So I know that their motivation was good in that situation, so like, even though I might be angry and I might be frustrated and I might have to address it in some way, I still feel like we can get over it because we're on the same. Our motivations are pointing in the same direction, which is that we want to get along, we want to respect each other. And then, and similarly, someone could behave in a much less egregious way, but if I know their motives are negative and hostile, and that it's not just about sort of a stereotypic representation of me, but it's actually about hatred, then I think I do have a very strong emotional response. So somehow, like, it's harder for me it's easy for me to control an angry response to someone who I believe has positive motives versus someone who seems negatively motivated, I guess.
So it's sort of a question of, is the behavior coming out of ignorance,
right,
and just lack of skill, which is much more forgivable and understandable, or is it coming from real animosity and deeply held prejudice?
Exactly. That's exactly what I mean. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Interesting.
We have a couple other questions here. So Dave asked, do we need diversity clubs or classes for people or children that struggle to meet a range of people in their day-to-day life to help combat bias? He says this would be logistically difficult.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, many of our cities and our lives and our cultures are set up in ways that really segregate us. And if we sort of go along the path that is laid out for many of us, we can self-segregate particularly people in privileged positions or with privileged aspects of their identities. It can be very easy to just find oneself surrounded by people who are very similar. I think, however, that it's not inevitable. And I think there are opportunities to connect with people who are different if one is on the lookout for those opportunities. And I think they actually come up more than we realize. So I don't know if a diversity club is exactly the direction I would go. But what I would say is there's really interesting research about the idea of collaborative work with people across differences for a common goal. So this kind of falls under the idea of contact theory, which was formalized by Allport, but developed a few decades earlier by people who were not recognized for it. That's another story. So Allport's idea was that if you bring people together across differences and you have them at equal status and they're working on a common goal collaboratively, this can start to decrease stereotyping and prejudice. And there's some interesting research that shows that's true. So what I would suggest, if someone is looking to kind of expand their horizons and really try to get to know people from different backgrounds and different identities, look for opportunities to work with a person who's different or a group that's different on a common goal, like a collaborative project where you're working together and you're at equal status. That, I think, is a really good way to start to break down stereotypes and assumptions and actually build relationships that can then further the process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so then that's a good lead in then to the question that Laura asked, which is about whether or not interventions will work with all ages. So she says, how do you suggest educating older people like my elderly parents? It seems easier to guide children, but how can you make changes within the older population?
Interesting. I have been very gratified to actually have a lot of conversations with older people since the book has come out. And the places where I have had those conversations the most are in environments where those folks are already hanging out and communicating. So I've had a number of conversations with like church book groups, for instance, which were made up of a lot of elderly people, retirees, and other people who wanted to be part of this book club. And so they read the book, and then they had these really rich conversations about thinking about their own lives and the way these patterns had played out in their own lives and what they might do differently. And so I actually think older people are, in my experience, have been quite receptive to learning and being reflective and bringing that kind of broad perspective that comes with age, that we know comes with age, to this subject. So I would say if you have elderly, folks in your life, certainly this book is a good place to start, but books that address this issue, I think, can be a really good launching place for productive conversations with older people.
Yeah, that makes me think too of my with my grandparents, talking to them about the different groups and the groups that I belong to, that there could be some really awkward moments with their language choices, but in a way they were more open about the actual issue. So they might slip up and say a word that we would think pretty offensive, but they would nevertheless reveal some insight about the where they're thinking about other people in a complex way. They're just sort of using the wrong language to talk about them. So I wonder, I mean, that might be a specific hurdle for the older generation, even if their minds are open to the ideas, or even more open to the ideas. Let's see. So Fiona asks, interesting that the question about how to change the mind of elderly people actually stereotypes elderly people as fixed. Well played, Fiona. Well called.
Thank you, Fiona. Very true.
Perhaps the questions, thank you for calling me on that. Perhaps the questions is how to change those who are resistant to change. Yeah.
Yes. Excellent point. Thank you, Fiona. That is very, very true. And in my experience, I've met many elderly people who were quite open and were able to bring this very broad perspective to the topic. So for people who are resistant to change, there are a few different ways of thinking about it. One of the challenges of this work is that some of the most productive interventions depend on people volunteering to be part of them, not being mandated to be part of them. And so if people are volunteering, they're already at least open to the idea. And the people who are closed do not volunteer to be part of it. So you do sort of have this built-in challenge of reaching people in a productive way who are resistant to change. One approach comes from some work that a psychologist named Betsy Levy-Paluck has done on social norms and networks. And so what she found is that, and actually there are a few studies that suggest this, that we are very influenced by what other people are doing, and particularly people who we see as popular or likable are doing. And so one way to affect people's behavior without actually persuading them to change their mind is simply by acting in a different way oneself, or having people who are popular and well-liked act in a different way, because their behavior then starts to become a norm that influences other people's behavior, even if those people aren't necessarily bought into the idea. So there's sort of like a backdoor way of affecting people's behavior simply by popularizing it. And so like at a workplace, there might be some anti-bias interventions that a small group of people are really supportive of. And if those people are well liked and popular and seen as leaders, and they start behaving in these new ways, that will start to influence other people's behavior. So that's one way. There are other approaches if you're talking about really entrenched beliefs. My book talks mostly about unexamined or unconscious bias, but if you're talking about really firmly held beliefs that oppose justice and fairness, then there's sort of a whole other range of approaches that need to be put into place that really target people's deeply held beliefs. There's something called deep canvassing, which has had kind of a bit of a strange history, but at least maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Katie, but the latest I've heard about deep canvassing, that approach actually does show that you can change people's minds about things that they'd previously been resistant to. And deep canvassing just involves kind of creating a bridge between the other person's emotional experience and personal experience and the issue at hand. So I think it's been mostly used in the context of reducing transphobia, reducing homophobia. But yeah, so there are kind of approaches that affect people who are committed to, not being fair toward others that actually have some evidence behind them too.
And in the book, you also talk about sort of the importance of understanding and learning about history as well.
Yes.
Which is sort of a similar idea, I guess, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting research that suggests that the more we understand the history of discrimination and how it's played out in the past, the better we're able to recognize it in the present. So I would absolutely love to see this really studied. I'd love to see a bunch of interventions tested that are based in just teaching people history. Because I experienced this myself as I was learning history, and while I was researching the book, the more I saw the history of sexism, the history of racism, and really understood the way that it was built into the fabric of so many of our institutions, the more I was able to really see it quite clearly in the present and become more motivated to work against it also.
Yeah. So Fiona asks, stereotypes are shortcuts that often protect a person's positional power. So how do we demonstrate the value of relinquishing some power?
Fiona with the excellent question. This is such $64,000 question. Why should anyone with privilege give it up? Right? Like, what is the benefit to the person who's maybe holding on to it tightly? And I'm really interested, Katie, to hear what you think. I think one way we can think about this is that maintaining our biases and maintaining our separation from other people, for those of us who have privileged aspects of our identities, makes authentic relationship impossible. And so I think that if a person values authentic relationships with others and wants to be trustworthy to others and wants to be able to see and be seen by others in a real way, in a deep way, one has to do this work. One has to let go of the toxic legacies that we've inherited of racial hierarchy, gender hierarchy based on sexual orientation, and others. Now that assumes someone wants to have authentic relationships with other people. If someone is a sociopath, I guess, I don't know how we would talk to, I don't know how they fit into this, but I think most people want to feel a sense of community, want to feel a sense of belonging, want to be in relationship with other people. But I'm curious what you think.
Well, so I guess I'm thinking that in a pluralistic society, if you're going to have collective power, so maybe if you're going to have collective power, you have to get along with a lot of different types of people. So you might be giving up the power of your whiteness, or the power of your straightness, or the power of being a man, but by forming, authentic relationships with people from different groups, you actually, I guess maybe it's idealistic, but I think that you gain collective power, and people are very we think in groups, right? We're very groupy thinkers. And if when you're choosing your team, you can choose any player who's out there, and you don't have to just choose people from your own group, then I guess in a sense you can gain power. So to the extent that people are motivated to gain power, there are some maybe positive ways of doing so, or maybe neutral ways of doing so. I guess that's
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, because I think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I guess I'm thinking about Sedanius's work and thinking about people, like sort of thinking about society as a hierarchy. I guess it's important for people to be, to be respected and to be admired and to have some place in the hierarchy. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. The problem is thinking about other members of other groups always necessarily below you on the hierarchy, and not thinking about the sort of collective raising yourselves up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I have a quick question to, let's get to, so Dave asks, do biases exist or thrive or dwindle where there are large differences in power between groups, actual or perceived power?
Do biases exist or thrive or dwindle when there are large differences of power between groups? I think one of the sort of bias is an expression of unexamined or unreflected upon associations or beliefs or stereotypes. When that is joined with power, it becomes extremely dangerous, because when, it's one thing to just sort of spontaneously make an assumption about someone. But if I don't, like, if I'm making an assumption about you, but I don't have any power over you, or, I don't determine your work trajectory, or the, assignments that you get given, or whether I have the power to arrest you or not, if I don't have some kind of power over you, that bias is its intensity or its consequence is somewhat contained. But the moment I have some sort of social power over you, that bias really becomes a weapon. And so, I don't know the answer to whether the bias itself increases if I have power over you, but the consequence of it and the severity of that consequence certainly increases to a point that it could become deadly. If I have the power to to protect, if I perceive that I have the power to protect my own life, and I think that you're a threat to my life, for instance, or if I'm a physician and I have the power to withhold pain medication because I stereotype you as someone who is exhibiting drug-seeking behavior because of a racial or ethnic stereotype. Or, there's so many different ways that my power over you then weaponizes my bias to become extremely dangerous, even to the point of life or death.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we have just a couple of minutes left, but I want to get one more question in here of my own, if I can butt in with one. So your book addresses all types of interventions. And when I think about bias interventions, I tend to think about, I think we focused on those that are geared towards reducing people's biases, but some interventions are geared towards supporting people who are the targets of biases. And in terms of those, you provide a great example of Nilanjana Dasgupta's work, where she showed that women engineering students benefited uniquely from having upper class women engineers as mentors. So can you talk a bit about interventions that support people who are the targets of bias and the sort of risks and benefits of those?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The intervention you mentioned is a great one. She found that when women engineering students had mentors who were just like a year or two ahead in school, if those women engineering students had women mentors, they stayed with the field, and if they didn't, many of them departed. But those women who had women mentors, 100% of the people in that study stayed with the engineering major. So yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about one of my favorite stories from the book is the story of Federico Ardila, who is a mathematician from South America, from Colombia, who had personally experienced a lot of alienation being in mathematical spaces. And as a Latino, was one of very few Latinos in math. And so when he became a professor himself, he started noticing that many of his women students and students from less represented racial or ethnic groups shared experiences with him that really echoed the experiences he'd had personally. And he started to see this as part of a pattern. And so he decided that he would create an environment that was supportive of these students, so he decided to kind of try to tackle the bias built into the sort of institutions of mathematics by focusing on creating a really positive environment in his own classroom. And so he did all these like really interesting things. I'll just mention a couple. He had students sign a contract at the beginning of the semester where they agreed to take I think it was open, generous, and positive attitude, to have an open, generous, and positive attitude and role in their work for the rest of the semester toward themselves and toward other students. So they kind of like agreed on a particular mindset at the beginning of the semester. He had students, he eliminated toxic language from his discussions of math. Math is often, there's language like it's easy to see or it's trivial to prove, and he got rid of language like that. He did a lot of different things to really try to mitigate these alienating experiences that students were having. And he's had incredible success. In his program, he did, there were maybe a dozen different things that he did to fix the math classroom. And of his first cohort of students, of 21 students in the cohort, 20 went on to get graduate degrees in math or related fields.
Wow.
Almost all from underrepresented backgrounds. And so I find that very inspiring. I find Ardila's work extremely motivating and inspiring because it shows that like not only can we address bias from the supply side, we can mitigate the bias in ourselves and in our organizations, but we can also work to positively reinforce environments for people to be able to thrive as well. And there are a lot of inspiring examples of that approach as well.
Great. I think that's an uplifting note to end on. I think we need to end here, but thanks everyone. And there's some important comments there, questions there from teachers here chiming in. But we got to wrap this up. But thanks so much, Jessica, for coming and talking to us and joining us here at the York Festival of Ideas. Great to read your book and to learn about your work. And so for those of you who are interested, Jessica's book is on the Festival of Ideas website through the End of Bias, How We Change Our Minds. So check out the website for that. And we hope you join us for other Festival of Ideas content in the coming days.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all the wonderful questions. What a great crowd. So thank you.